webinar, Editorial Strategy, Content Evaluation and Design, the third in our 2014 series. We're very pleased that you can join us today. I'm Gerald Lillian, CEO at Allen Press, and your organizer for SSP's webinar program. Before we get started, there are just a few housekeeping items to cover. Your phone is automatically muted in consideration of our presenters and your fellow webinar participants. Please use the text chat feature and set to organizers and panelists only to send in questions or notify us that you are having technical difficulties. Also, please specify to which presenter you would like your question directed. Questions can be sent at any time, but will be compiled and presented to the panelists once all prepared presentations are completed. At the conclusion of today's presentation, you will receive a webinar evaluation via email. We encourage you to provide feedback so we can continually improve our webinar program. You will also receive a link via email to the recorded broadcast of this webinar and to the slides. Our moderator today is Maggie Hayworth, currently the Associate Director of Publishing Operations at the Endocrine Society, where she previously served as Managing Editor for Endocrine Reviews, Molecular Endocrinology, and Hormones and Cancer. In addition to her membership with SSP, she's actively involved with the International Society for Managing and Technical Editors and serves as its representative to the Chicago Collaborative. It is now my pleasure to turn the webinar over to Maggie so she can introduce our panel and get us underway. Maggie?
Thank you, Gerald. To examine how expectations for scientific content have shifted, we have speaking today three people who have directly experienced these dramatic changes. Our first panelist is Dr. Paul Robertson with the Pacific Northwest Diabetes Research Institute in Seattle, Washington. His years of experience as a scientist are complemented by his experience as the editor-in-chief of major journals. Our next panelist is David Haber, a publishing workflow analyst with Symbeo Publisher Services. David has a thorough understanding of the technical details of production, combined with a broad and inclusive view of where publishing has been and where it might be going. In addition to our panelists, we have with us Michael Levine-Clark, Professor and Associate Dean for Scholarly Communication and Collection Services at the University of Denver Libraries. Michael brings to us the essential viewpoint of a librarian. During the webinar, as issues come up pertaining to the role of the library and librarians, such as library journal collections, archiving, indexing, perpetual access, and the potential loss of valuable materials, Michael will provide the needed perspective and background. Before I turn the session over to Paul Robertson, I'll review some of the broader questions and issues that came up during our discussions about the topic. First, we know that roles have changed. Researchers are now responsible for the production of their work in a way that goes way beyond simply writing the text of the paper. Publishers now have to consider questions of archiving as well as stay current on new requirements for funding and access. And librarians are now working with faculty in their institutions to establish institutional repositories. These are all examples of the many, many changes that are occurring. We hope to use this time to help define what these shifts are and the issues that have arisen as a result. What's remained the same, what's different, and what's still very unclear. I'll now turn the presentation over to our first speaker, Paul Robertson. Paul?
Well, good morning, everybody. This is good morning in Seattle. Maggie asked me to give you an overall view of what used to be and what is now. So let me start with what used to be. When I started publishing scientific journals, this is probably in 1960. So I've seen about over 50 years now of this and how things have changed a great deal. At the very beginning, it was the pinnacle point. The scientist is when you finally submitted your manuscript, you got the reviews back, you modified your paper, and then it was published. And all was wonderful because all you were working with was yourself, your secretary in those days, and your secretary in those days was typing on the typewriter with whiteout, so that you were very cautious about giving her too many drafts because you could lose a good secretary that way. So the investigator spent most of his or her time really working on the manuscript, doing about 14 drafts with pencil at home, coming in on bended knee, giving it to her secretary and hoping that she would have time to get it done that day or that week. That's a totally different process, of course, than we have today because we have no secretaries. Scientists basically are doing all the typing themselves, going through all the websites, trying to figure out how to keep up with changes in technology rather than being obsessed with not displacing the secretary. So that has been a huge change, and I can't underscore more to you why this process is so important. Like I tell my fellows and students every day, you're doing experiments, the data are wonderful, but until you publish your data, they do not exist. There's nobody out there to read your data if they can't find it in print or at least on the internet. That's an important thing because the younger generation of scientists have gotten so used to the electronic process that they get that, but what they don't get is that they have to know about things in the past before they can write about things in the future. It takes, I would say, a continual effort on my part to teach people it's not enough to look at abstracts on the internet. You really do have to get the whole paper. And that's a problem because it's not as accessible to young people as it might be to older people who are on faculty who have access to the university library. So it becomes a continual problem. And even if they even have access, there are times when one must actually get to the library. And I would guess that half the people I take on board have no idea where the library is, what part of the building it is in. And when they get in there, they get totally lost. And that may sound humorous, but it's not humorous at all if you need to know what seminal publications look like and where all of the preliminary data came from. That's essential, obviously, because we don't want people redoing experiments that were published 25 years ago. And yet, that happens annually to me, at least, going to meetings, either at the American Diabetes Association or the Endocrine Society, when someone stands up and gives a paper, presenting data that is very, very similar to what's been published 25 years ago, especially in areas like physiology. And how do you cope with that? When you want to tell the poor presenter, you know, didn't you read that paper by Smith et al. In 1925, the American Journal of Physiology? But you don't want to say that in front of a microphone, obviously. So it gets to be almost comical sometimes. We think we are now really communicating with each other. I think it's two in one plane, on the plane of the present, but in the plane of the past, let me tell you, communication is not so good with our modern methodologies. So there's some good and bad things about where we are today. The really good things, just to cap up, are we now have the excellent people that we can work with in terms of copy, in terms of editors, in terms of process. That's terrific when it works well. It gets a little bit clunky because the submission sites we use are all idiosyncratic. They all have their own way of doing it. So I will sometimes, when I'm submitting to a paper to a given journal online for the first time, spend no less than 3 or 4 hours trying to figure out how to maneuver around their particular site. Once I've got it, I got it. But it'd be nice if the sites were a little more generic. Once you get through that, there's a huge net gain in convenience and I think accuracy in the publication process. Just again in terms of recap, but I think we've lost a great deal in terms of connectivity with the past. Some other things that may be more trivial, we don't have the same kind of copy editing going on. So one sees poor grammar coming out in some publications, but they're understandable. So that's just not a terrifically big issue. But connectivity with past data is a huge issue. And I think that's something that is still a problem that nobody's resolved. So I'll stop there and wait for the next speaker.
All right. Thank you very much, Paul. Next we have David Haber. And David?
Yes. I'm a publishing workflow analyst at Synveo Publisher Services, and to give a little background on what I do, because I think it will color where I'm coming from this conversation a bit. So what I help publishers institute and install new products and technologies. So over time, I've been watching how the industry is shifting and altering in in incremental steps for about the last 15 years. So I started in this industry as a copy editor, so I'm going to approach this kind of talk about from the point of view of how copy editing has changed a little bit, because I think that will inform the whole discussion. Because basically, we all know speed to publication now is paramount to everything. And because of that, there are some trade-offs. And looking at it from a purely copy editing perspective, we see the advent of new tools, for example. So when I started in this industry, it was right about the time when electronic manuscript preparation started. Right as I was starting, we were still double keying manuscripts. We would receive them, in Times New Roman double spaced, and we would rekey them, flatten the document, and begin the copy editing process. Now we have all sorts of automated scripts and tools to help us make the copy editing process quicker. And one spot where it's definitely evident is something like reference sections. So there's all kinds of tools out there to help process references in an automated fashion. When I first started copy editing a reference list could take hours, even days if it was a review article. Now, processing references and styling them to the journal specifications, it takes a matter of hours, if that. In the past, we were checking references both in terms of style and missing elements. Now, and we were doing that check for each and every reference. Now, it's a reverse process where a copy editor may only focus on the references that are flagged. So this piece of, this reference, this article, this book is missing a certain element, a page number, maybe a DOI, an author, and the copy editor will then check that particular reference. Instead of in the past where the copy editor was charged with checking each reference, both in terms of where it fell in the text and also how it fell almost into the corpus of what the author or researcher was trying to say. And I think that's an important thing that has changed, because now copy editors don't necessarily pay attention to that. They aren't that third or fourth set of eyes on a manuscript that help save the researcher from themselves in some way. Maybe an article wasn't cited in the text, maybe it got confused and duplicated or is missing a vital piece of information. And because copy editors no longer concern themselves with that sort of checking, because it's more of an automated script process, yes, the trade-off is they can go faster, but also some vital pieces of information may be missed and may get published. And that's important to remember in terms of discoverability, which we talked about before, which I think is really vital now. Because publication is happening so quickly, and so the drive from the funders and the institutions and academia in general to publish as quickly as you can. Because of that drive, what's happening is our ability to discover things, on one hand, is a vital thing, as was spoken of earlier, but on the other, it's vital pieces could be missing that are normally caught by the copy editing process, which people aren't concerning themselves with anymore. So I think what's happening is we're trading off technological scripting for the eye of a trained copy editor on certain pieces of an article. And because that's happening, we are seeing a glorious sort of speed to publication. We're seeing times of publication that are incredible, and which on the surface are, from like a research perspective, yes, the science is getting out there quicker. It's available to everyone. People are able to access it, all spectacular things. But one of the downsides of that speed to publication is there's no longer a natural check of filtering content as it works its way through the publication process. And that natural filter, I think, is sort of deluging researchers and the public with oodles and oodles of content, and it's really hard to sort through things. And that's where discoverability becomes so important. And then the question then becomes is, who's responsible to help make things more discoverable, right? And it's being pushed, that sort of activity is being pushed to copy editing. So the copy editor reads the file, they help establish keywords, they help tag files a certain way that optimize this mystical, magical thing called XML, which helps in archiving and helps us find things. But traditionally, a copy editor's role was one of the English language, grammar, journal style. And it's not one of aiding in discoverability. So there's been this shift. It's gradual over time, and copy editors are starting to be forced to focus more on articles as data rather than articles as words. And I think, I'm not saying that's a bad thing or a good thing, but it's a definite different thing. And because it's a different thing, I think we as editors, researchers, and publishers have to be aware of that and what some of the implications might be because of that slow shift. Let's take an example of continuous publication versus issue publication, for example, right? So issue publication, publishers had a natural backlog in some ways, and articles would work their way through publication, the production process, and there was a set amount of time that it would take for an article to publish. So let's say anywhere between, once it cleared a peer review process, anywhere between, you know, maybe 3 months to a year traditionally, maybe 10, 15 years ago. Now those publication times are record-breaking. We can publish articles in 10 days or less from acceptance to publication. And so because there's no technological impediment to publishing quickly, we do that. But what's happening is, at least I see, publishers are starting to struggle with, okay, so we can publish quickly, but do we want to publish that quickly? Because there's a limit that we as scientists and researchers and readers can ingest. So that's starting to create new realms of technology in terms of treating articles as machine readable, which from a copy editing perspective makes me cringe in some ways, because as a copy editor, I see over time my job is going to be focused more and more on making words not into English and magnificent pieces of, I wouldn't even say literature, but typeset pretty articles. And it's going to be more about what sort of data does this article represent, and how can a machine read it in the future so that a future researcher can find it because it could be important. And that's a very different activity and almost a different business than traditional publishing as it is right now. So that's not to suggest, like I've heard complaints over time about copy editing quality. Because of the drive to publish faster, every piece of a given publication process is compressed. Peer review is compressed. Writing as an author is compressed because of the funding requirements and the need to publish as quickly as possible. The typesetting process, the composition process, the creating web deliverable process, everything is compressed, including copy editing. And on the surface, that would appear to affect the quality of copy editors, of articles themselves. So maybe there's poor grammar, maybe there's poor layouts, tables aren't designed in the optimal way. Those are the complaints we sometimes hear as speeds to publication increase. But when looking at it, those complaints are mostly anecdotal in the sense that publishers and authors both aren't necessarily the driving force behind those complaints, I guess is what I'm saying. And that's a shift, and I think the shift is something can be summed up in this way. Over the last 5 years, somewhere in there, publishers have relaxed their styles and are deferring more to the authors and researchers. And as experts in their field, because the science that we're publishing now is incredibly technical. And because of that, publishers are saying, okay, these style points we have are no longer important, whether they're grammar related or stylistic in terms of, whether you italicize a gene or you handle protein names in this way or that way or whatever. Those sorts of things are becoming less important from a copy editor perspective, because the expectation is that the authors know this, the researchers know this, and therefore you, what we call in copy editing, you follow copy. And that's the general trend now in copy editing. Follow copy, authors write. There's certain key style points you have that you focus on, but these other things that you may have focused on in the past, you don't have to worry about. But because of the new technological requirements about discoverability, copy editors are having to focus on more data-driven concepts like fundref, like ORCID IDs, like database IDs that they have to check and cross-check. So whereas publishers may have concerned themselves in the past whether a gene name was italic or Roman and printed errata about those particular things in the past, now they're less likely to do that. And they're more likely to focus on things like this particular gene name, gene database is not linking properly because it's wrong in the paper, and that is something a copy editor should have handled, and therefore it's a correction. So the types of corrections are different, but I wouldn't say the frequency is increased necessarily. But again, that's all driven by this kind of shift but from print publication to digital publication in the new world that it's opened for us. So I guess in summary here, the speed that we publish things now has shifted what copy editors focus on, what authors and researchers have to focus on, and where their responsibilities lie in terms of publication. And because of the need to make this massive corpus discoverable by new researchers and new students, there are these new requirements that production folks, copy editors, and XML people have to focus and understand and integrate into their copy editing process. which means that the type of people that are copy editors is slowly changing.
Thank you very much, David. I do have a question for you and then a question for Michael. First of all, from what I've seen, there are certain requirements now that are more automated than others. For example, ORCID IDs, funding. You have submission systems now that automate that information as far as author submission and collection for production. But then there are also systems that don't have that automated yet. So we seem to be in a transition period right now. Do you have any thoughts or recommendations on that?
Yes, you bring up a perfect point, and I'll use ORCID IDs as an example. So we have submission systems that collect ORCID IDs, and if you're not familiar with what an ORCID ID is, basically it's an identifier for a researcher. And all one's research gets published under this identifier, and it collates it in the ORCID database so that you have a record of everything you've published. So during submission, a lot of submission systems collect this information, which is spectacular and great. But then a key point of that collection is getting that information into a published file. And on the surface, it'd be nice to say it's all automated. So you have a name in a file that's being pushed through production, and you have a name in a peer review system with an ID associated, and you can match them easily, no problem, easy as cake. But the challenge is, at this point in how we handle our files, we have peer review information metadata that contain ORCID IDs, and we have these things, the articles themselves, the manuscripts, the Word files, and that information doesn't always match. Whether it's because someone else fills out and submits the manuscript during peer review and they fill out a name differently, and it pulls in a different ORCID ID, or pulls in the correct ORCID ID and the person actually writing the paper has an old version of the author's name, matching that falls to the copy editor, really. I'd like to say it was an automated process, and in many cases it can be. But because of the way we submit files and we handle them in Microsoft Word or other word processing programs, you can't have a completely automated process. So I think one of the challenges going forward in STM publishing is figuring out a way to author files in a seamless way, so that, and in a consistent way across the industry, so that there's an easy way for people to both collect metadata and submit files, and also write about the research, so that you can connect all this disparate metadata in an easy way, rather than through a hodgepodge of automated scripting and copy editor responsibility. Because whenever you have a person involved, there's a potential of having an error introduced. And something as simple as mixing up an ORCID ID and mixing up a name can have ramifications down the line because of the way funders approach their content and how they want it to be published with various license statements, how institutions are driving their authors to publish, and basically how researchers want to get credit for their work. And that's but one small example of how metadata and Word files can sometimes be in conflict, and there has to be some sort of marriage between the two. And that marriage usually occurs during copy editing in an unautomated way. So I guess the challenge, to sum up, the challenge would be to figure out a way or create a solution in which submission and authoring and data collection even are all unified in some sort of easy, simple way. Because you don't want to force people to do more work. You don't want to have researchers who should be focused on researching have to go through multiple steps just to submit a manuscript, and then multiple steps to actually write their manuscript, and then multiple steps to marry all the different pieces together and cross-check everything. You don't want to have researchers spending their time on that kind of thing. You want to have researchers spending their time on research.
So it sounds like we have the traditional paper format, which well, not paper anymore, but it's in a Word document now, but it's still the traditional format. And it's being put into a system that really deals with text blocks and answering questions and metadata. So in a way, if the information that's in the Word doc could be entered once without the redundancy that's inherent in the submission systems now, then that problem might be solved.
Yes, that is true. I agree with that. Okay.
Now, Michael, I was hoping you could comment on some of the themes that have arisen, the speed, the incredible speed of an accepted paper appearing in early release in various places, and then also the volume, just the sheer volume of material that's being published. What has the impact been on librarians as far as making certain that faculty and other users have access to that information?
Yeah, I've been sort of sitting here thinking about issues of discovery and issues of sort of just the huge amount of information that we have to manage, and I think that some of the trends that we've already heard about are also happening in libraries, and certainly the issue of automation of processes. Because papers are being published so fast, there's an expectation that they be indexed quickly, and so publishers feed the metadata to the vendors that supply the indexing, whether that's somebody like ProQuest doing a general indexing tool or somebody that's creating a more specialized index tool like biological abstracts. What used to happen is that people who were employed by the indexers would look at those articles. They probably didn't read the articles, but they at least looked at the article and they described that article in a manual way. They typed that information into a system. They followed a specialized thesaurus. They followed standards for how you describe that article. So months later, we would receive that index and we would be able to find that article. And then that gradually became weeks later and days later. And now it's an automated process and it's almost immediate. But the drawback is that even the better indexes, even the specialized indexes, are more reliant on author keywords or copy editor supplied keywords than on a specialized thesaurus. And the more general indexes and the discovery tools are almost entirely reliant on whatever is supplied by the publisher or the author. And even taking aside questions of quality, there are issues of consistency then. If you're supplying different keywords, and the keywords are what you're relying on to find that information, you end up with inconsistencies of what you find with a particular keyword, depending on what the author plugged in as the topic keyword. Traditionally we had the ability to pull things together based on a subject term, based on a standard descriptor, and that's harder and harder to do. So that's one issue. The other sort of related issue is that we've moved more and more from these specialized indexes, which were better for finding information on a particular subject than a general index, no doubt about that. But they were confusing, and as we've added more and more indexes, my library now subscribes to probably 1,000 different databases if you add in all these little specialized things, especially primary source collections in humanities. But it makes it really hard for any student to keep track of which index to use to find information. And so you move to something like ProQuest Academic Search Complete, which is a general index, and then the next logical step is to something like Summon or Primo or WorldCat Local or EBSCO Discovery Service, which are these overarching discovery tools that search across everything. And so it becomes harder and harder to find specialized information using specialized search terms. This is not necessarily good or bad. It's different, I think, as with the copy editing issues. We're changing the way people find information. We're not necessarily making it better or worse. So, Maggie, you
Rod, I was wondering who is serving as the authority in these cases, and I'm guessing that it's the librarian who now has this new role of having to recommend which databases are the most authoritative.
Right, and we've always done that to some extent, right? But I think what's happened is, well, I'll say we've always done that, and we still do that. We still, if somebody comes to us and we have a research consultation, we say, for your topic, you should be looking here, and this is a good database, and here's why it's a good database. But at the same time, we are teaching our students that when in doubt, search one of these general tools, with the assumption that it's better to find something than nothing. It's better to start in a tool where you're going to find something than to start in the wrong tool. And so there is this tension, and it's one that plays out, I think, in every library. We subscribe to all these specialized tools. We recognize that for specific topics in that discipline, those specialized tools are generally better. At the same time, we are subscribing to these general tools, and we are pushing the bulk of our undergraduates especially to use those. And it's better that they do that than that they don't find anything. But we have it's a constant tension, and it's the same thing is happening in the library catalog, where we have outsourced the cataloging of books. It's happening in terms of how we build our collections, even, that we're going with a sort of a bulk approach. We are subscribing to huge packages of journals where we used to individually select each title. At the University of Denver, this has been a great thing. We used to subscribe to somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000, 6,000 academic journals. They matched our curriculum, they matched our research interests of our faculty, but they weren't enough. We never had enough. There were journals that were requested and we couldn't afford. When we moved to this model with subscribing to a big deal, a journal package, we suddenly had enough, but in a way we have too much, and it's hard to point a student, especially, to the right article or to the right journal, and there is this sort of overwhelming flow of information that's hard to manage.
Okay, so we're still murky there. We really don't have any answers.
Right. I mean, I think it's a net benefit in that now at this university and at most universities, far more of the article content that is of value to anybody at that university is available on the campus, certainly than it was in the past. The issue now is how do you figure out which of those journals is a better journal, and how do you figure out where you should be looking and where you shouldn't be looking? But I think it's a net benefit. That overwhelming amount of information is actually a good thing, and that doesn't even get into all the information that is out there on the web that isn't being indexed by libraries or collected by libraries or preserved by libraries.
Usually that's an issue that's come up during the discussions I've had with you and with David and with Paul. This, I don't want to say outlaw literature, but in a way it is. It's material that's out there that's not following the standard procedure. It's not in the strict format, and it's very valuable, and it could very well be lost.
Right, right, and yeah, I mean, that's, from a library perspective, that's a huge concern. The journal literature, even though we've kind of pushed that responsibility for archiving onto publishers and onto other third parties, so Portico and Locks, which are these tools that are used by contracting with publishers, are used to preserve journal content. We're not preserving it ourselves in the libraries, but we're working with people to do that. And I'm pretty confident about the fact that major journal publisher content is not going to go away. It's not going to disappear. I worry much more about that brilliant website that covers a particular topic, or the white paper that somebody wrote that they posted on their website, or the blog that presents sort of a layperson's approach to something, or even a deeper approach to something. And how do we preserve that? How do we get our students to that information? How do we make sure that if somebody cites it, it's still available to check up on 25 years from now when somebody wants to look back at the research that led to an article? And I don't know how we do that. So that's a huge issue.
Yeah. So that's one of the things that's very concerning about moving forward with archives. So in the past, we had a single article. It was in print somewhere, and if you found a copy of it in print, you had the article. But say 20 years from now, if someone is trying to access an article that was published in 2014, they might be trying to access an article that has supplemental data, that links out to multiple databases, that has all this extra material that was required for publication and was considered important. But chances are very good that that information will be lost. So
yeah, and if that's already happened, I've had that happen with an article I wrote that I published probably in 2006, 2007, and I got an email from somebody maybe 6 months ago saying that the tables and the survey that you linked to are gone. It was an article that changed it was a journal that changed publishers. All the supplemental stuff was stripped away. I had some of it still in my hard drive, but I didn't have it in the way it was formatted. I didn't know for sure which table matched which table number in the article. I was recreating it and I was able to share it, and then the new publisher said, we're not interested in linking it. We're not going to link to that stuff, but it's still referred to in my article. So with dead links.
Interesting, and it's the online version of articles that are considered to be the version of record.
Right.
So David and Paul, do you have any thoughts on the future of the article, and perhaps it should be leaner and not with as many links or supplemental data, something that we can be confident about preserving? David?
I do think that, I don't have the answer, but I do think that we should try to rethink what a journal article is in this digital publishing environment. What's necessary for it, what's necessary for science to move forward, and what's data. Because I think they're two separate things, and they're two separate activities to curate those two different things. So it's one thing to say during peer review, give us all your data, we need to see everything. We'll just publish it as supporting supplemental information somehow. We just need to see it all because we want to make sure that the science is accurate. And it's another thing to actually report on one's findings and to reach conclusions and move science forward. I think we really need to consider the role of what a journal article is, and what all this data that may accompany it is, and how they're different, and how one should think about publishing that information. And what struck me just now is the point about blog posts and how to archive that. I think that's really important because as publishers try to push research forward in the way they're publishing things, they really need to think about the long-term implications of hosting these sort of blog posts, or even something like post-publication peer review where you're having comments on articles and science is moving forward that way. Like, how do you archive that? What's the role as a publisher? I think that's really important. And I think by defining what an article is and as a bare minimum object, like this is what we're going to say an article is in this field, and this is really important, and no matter what publisher publishes this article in this field, this is what it has to be. I think that's really an important activity to go through, because I think long term you will have archiving issues and dead links everywhere. And based on what some of my family members are going through in academia now and how they're doing research, they're so web-based in their research. I fear that if we don't come up with a way of archiving these data-driven concepts or these different sort of formats in a good, coherent way, research will stop because current students don't know how to find new information or check new information except by clicking on a link. And if all the links are dead, a very valid, important paper could likely be never cited again because no one could check up on it. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense.
Thank you, David. Paul, could you comment on what you would like to see in a scientific article as a researcher, as an editor, and if you feel that the link outs and the supplemental data and the new electronic enhancements that have occurred, do you feel that those are absolutely necessary?
Well, I think the dirty secret here is supplemental data. Primarily, they are driven by reviewers. Reviewers today are much more hard-nosed than they've ever been in the past. The whole business about publishing science has gotten so competitive that it's given birth to articles that have way too many data within the pages, the 4 or 5 pages that they take. It may say 7 figures, but within those 7 figures, there are subfigures, so there may be up to 35 figures in some journals. Why should that be? Well, the competitive nature of scientists and scientists is that you want to publish in the best journal always, and it has a way of feeding on itself. So now in Science or the Journal of Clinical Investigation or Nature, you pick one of those articles, well, you don't even see the figures. It's impossible. You have to go online to magnify the pictures to really understand the data. So that's all madness as far as I'm concerned. And I think that's something that editors have to take charge of and not allow reviewers to drive manuscript review to such an extent that the poor author is sending in more and more and more data that frankly he or she didn't want to publish in the first place. It's just totally unregulated. And I think a little common sense might go a long way to just saying we're not going to publish supplemental data. If the data are important to publish, they should be in the principal part of the manuscript. Why do we have to have data on the side that if anyone even takes the trouble to look for? Now that you're telling me the story that supplemental data that has been lost, it just reinforces my prejudices that it's not a good thing to have supplemental data.
Right, and I should say that my example of supplemental data that was lost it was an issue of the journal still having a significant enough print circulation that they cared about print, and they pushed me to pull out a couple of tables that I actually thought were pretty key and linked to them because of space limitations that shouldn't be an issue with electronic publication. So I think there's an issue where supplemental data that is truly supplemental probably needs to be treated in a different way. But shrinking an article to fit a particular format to me makes no sense now that we are mostly electronic in terms of publication. So even if there's still a print run, the print run shouldn't be driving decisions.
That's a very good point. I think for a long time we were thinking that they would be one version of the other, but that's really not the case. They're very different creations. So
right.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
No, I was just agreeing with you. Go ahead.
Okay. We did get a comment from one of the attendees who mentioned a product called Web Citation. Have any of you heard of this? Sounds like no one has.
No.
But that's something I'm definitely going to Google, see what we can do to find out more about it. I'd like to go on and put out a call for any questions. If anyone would like to submit any questions, now would be a good time. We have about 8 minutes to go. And David or Paul or Michael, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I want to go back to the supplemental data. This is Michael. You know, I think certainly from a library perspective and a preserving perspective of preserving and making information accessible to people. While it may be that the article is not the right place for that, there's really a tremendous need to be preserving that in some way and indexing that in some way. So I worry about it being lost, and I worry a lot about the fact that we don't quite have a standard way of presenting that. It would be good, I think, to have, if it were going to be the consensus that we're not going to publish scientific data in this discipline, or we're not going to publish supplemental data in this discipline, there should be a consensus about how to make it available, and there should be some easy way of getting access to it. There should be a preservation tool of some sort, whether that's managed by libraries or societies or somebody else, I don't know. But I think that's an important piece that I don't want to lose.
That's a huge issue. That, well, you're right. While supplemental data could be very, very useful, right now it's presented in a rather inconsistent way and difficult to retrieve in and of itself. So it seems that perhaps in an ideal world there would be some centralized locations that would store it, back it up, and also provide some sort of structure so the metadata would be consistent.
Well, this is Dave. I will say that there are services out there that do that sort of thing, whether it's Dryad or Figshare and things like that. But I see the problem in a slightly different way, in the sense that I don't think that, and this goes back to something Paul said, I don't see editors and publishers taking charge and saying, this bit of information that we have doesn't have anything to do with this article, we're not going to publish it. I've seen so many times where articles will get accepted and sent to the typesetter or whoever for production, and all these accompanying files come in, and copy editors will raise their hand and say, what do we do with this thing and that piece and this weird thing and that weird computer program? What do you want us to do with this stuff? And the publisher will say, oh, we don't know what it is, but it must be important because it was asked for in peer review, so we must publish it. So it seems like that there's no sort of control anymore, no more filtering of that sort of information. It's true that there is supporting information standards, whether it's through NISO that's working through the process and new XML standards for archiving that kind of information, which is great and wonderful. But I don't see any sort of comprehensive, coherent filtering mechanism, because everyone sort of is just throwing up their hands. The authors will say, well, the peer reviewer wanted all this stuff, and the publisher will say, well, the author submitted it, so therefore we must publish it. So I think there has to be some sort of controlling individual trying to sort through this mass of data.
That's an excellent point. We simply have to be more careful about what material we do put out there.
Well, and then the lore of
So let me
supporting.
chime in.
Oh, go ahead.
Let me just add, recently I reviewed an article for the Journal of Clinical Investigation, which in my field is quite prestigious. The editors of that field expressly now say, we do not want any more than 3 criticisms on this article. We're getting way too many requests for scientists to create new data by doing additional experiments going in directions that didn't even plan. I think it's important for all of us to sit back and say 2 things. A, the editor has got to step in and take charge, otherwise this is just going to grow to infinity. And secondly, and more fundamentally, one has to understand the social pathology in scientific publication these days. I just do simply not agree that we have to publish as rapidly as publishers seem to think we have to publish. They're responding to perceived pressures, but I frankly don't care with my articles published in a month or 3 months. It's going to get out there. It really doesn't make any difference to me. So I question where that push on publishers is coming from. Secondly, we have to understand what the life of the scientist today is really on the rugged edge. If you just think about getting grants funded today, now we are lucky if you get in the 9th percentile. If you get a score that's in the 12th percentile, you have to rewrite the thing. It takes you 9 months to get it back in. And everybody's doing it now. So there's so much writing going on in a scientist's life, most of it being rejected by NIH or wherever the grant funding comes from. They're angry people. And when they review your articles and you're stepping on their toes scientifically, you're pushing them on. You're pushing a button that just gets them angrier. And it's pretty hard to quantify, but if you just sit down sometimes and have a bottle of beer at one of these scientific meetings, you will hear people continually griping about the review process, about reviewers asking for excessive amounts of material, and everybody's unhappy. So we have to recognize what we're dealing with here. There is a human side to all this. It's not just a mechanical operation of publishing data. And believe me, just because data exists does not mean they have to be published. I have a drawer full of manuscripts that has never seen publication. And when I was going through my training, my mentors taught me, if you publish everything that you do, you're publishing garbage. You just can't expect every experiment to be publishable. But there's kind of this mentality that you have to publish so much data, so much data, so much data, otherwise you will not be competitive in getting your NIH grant funded. And that's probably a grain of truth in that. But it doesn't mean that we have to be part of that process as editors or as publishers. We need to have standards of our own and not just respond to the anonymous author who we perceive are making demands on us.
Paul, thank you so much. I think that's a beautiful summary to this whole discussion. I think we've all been so busy keeping up with the technological changes and trying to figure out how best to use them that we've lost that human touch there. And we need to take that back. We need to regain that. So I'd like to thank everyone, the panelists, for participating. This has been a wonderful discussion. And thank you for those of you who attended, and I hope you take away something useful from this. Gerald, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you, Maggie, and to all of our panel and to the audience, as already said. I want to just remind everybody that you will get a link with a survey, and please do give us that feedback we use to improve the program. And on that note, we also hope you will join us October 14th at the same time for the 4th and final in the 2014 series of webinars, Publishing Services Vendor Integration. So something that probably follows on this topic fairly well indeed in terms of the technology and the massive work that it takes to integrate all this technology. So our session is now concluded. Please do enjoy the rest of your day.